That dock comes down by Friday, or I'll have it torn down and bill you for the demolition, the disposal, and the $5,000 fine for unauthorized construction on community property," she said, her voice a low, smug rumble that seemed to vibrate with the sheer pleasure of her own authority. Karen, the HOA president, stood on the edge of my lawn, her floral print muumuu a garish splash of color against the serene green of the landscape my family had owned for a century. Her arms were crossed over her substantial chest, a clipboard clutched in one hand like a scepter, and her face was a mask of self-righteous certainty. The little wooden dock, barely 10 feet long, sat peacefully on the edge of the pond. A project my son and I had just finished, a place for casting a line and watching the sunset, a tribute to the memory of my grandfather who taught me to fish on this very water. To her, it was an act of war. "This entire waterfront is a protected community asset, Sergeant Miller," she continued, misusing my old rank like a weapon meant to diminish me. "And I am the sworn protector of this community. Your little project is a flagrant violation of Article 7, Section 4 of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I'll expect your full compliance." She gave a tight, satisfied smile, as if she'd just won a major battle, and turned to leave before I could even process the sheer audacity of her proclamation. The casual threat of thousands of dollars in fines and the destruction of my property hung in the air, a foul stench of bureaucratic poison. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-mad HOA board member who thinks they're the queen of a suburban fiefdom, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare. You have no idea how much it helps to know you're not alone in these fights. Now let me tell you how I handed Queen Karen the rope she used to hang her own corrupt little empire. My story with this land didn't start when I bought a cookie-cutter house in a manicured subdivision. It started 3 generations before that, when my great-grandfather, a farmer with more grit than money, bought 200 acres of rolling Virginia woodland and a natural spring-fed pond. He built a life here. My grandfather, a man as solid and dependable as the oak trees he planted, inherited it from him. It was on his knee that I learned the names of the birds that nested in the reeds and the feel of a fishing line going taut with a hungry base. He was a quiet man, a surveyor by trade before the war, and he knew every inch of this land not by sight but by heart. He'd walked its boundaries 1,000 times, his transit and level a familiar part of the landscape. After my 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building things in places a lot less peaceful than this, I came home. My wife Sarah and I wanted our kids to have what I had, roots, a connection to something real. When Grandpa passed, he left me his house and the 5 acres immediately surrounding it, the heart of the original estate. The rest of the land, the other 195 acres, he had sold off to a developer back in the late 90s. A decision that had pained him but was necessary at the time. That sale gave birth to the Lakeside Meadows community, a sprawling development of identical homes with identical lawns, all governed by a thick book of rules and the iron fist of its homeowners association. My property was an island of history in a sea of beige siding, grandfathered in, exempt from the HOA's grasp, or so I had always believed. We were neighbors, but not members. We paid no dues and followed no covenants, a fact that had been a constant source of irritation for the board, and for Karen in particular, for years. She saw my land not as a historical holdout, but as a rogue state, an untamed territory that defied her control, and she couldn't stand it. That little dock was just the excuse she had been waiting for. It was a visible, tangible assertion of my rights, a declaration that this was my land, my water, and she was determined to prove me wrong. The confrontation wasn't just about a few planks of wood, it was about sovereignty. It was about her burning need to bring every square inch of her world under her dominion, and my quiet, unshakable belief that a man's home, his legacy, is his own. She had no idea that in my grandfather's dusty attic, tucked away in a heavy oak chest, wasn't just old photographs and war medals, but the original survey maps, the hand-drawn plats, and the meticulously recorded deed from a time when the only covenant was a man's word and a handshake. She had demanded I prove my ownership. She was about to get a history lesson she would never forget. The official letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail, as if it were a legal summons from a high court. The envelope was thick, embossed with the Lakeside Meadows HOA logo, a stylized swan on a cartoonishly blue pond, and it felt heavy with malice. Inside, printed on expensive letterhead, was a formal declaration of my transgressions. The language was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression, a flood of legalese and citations designed to intimidate and overwhelm. It listed the unauthorized structure, the violation of community aesthetic standards, and the environmental impact on a shared waterway. The fine had been solidified at $5,000, with an additional $100 penalty for each day the dock remained standing past the Friday deadline. It was signed with a flourish by Karen Billings, President, Lakeside Meadows HOA, her signature a series of sharp, angry peaks and valleys. Attached was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my dock, taken from across the pond, a piece of surveillance that felt deeply invasive. She was watching me, documenting me, building her case. My first instinct, the one honed by years of dealing with insurgents and uncooperative local leaders, was to remain calm. Anger is a fire that consumes the vessel it's held in. Strategy requires a cool head. I sat down at my kitchen table, the letter spread out before me, and took a long, slow breath. Sarah watched me, her expression a mixture of anger and concern. "This is insane, Jack," she said, her voice tight. "She can't do this. This is our property. The pond is on our property." I nodded, tapping the letter. "According to this, it's not. It's a shared waterway and community property. She's not just claiming jurisdiction over the dock. She's claiming jurisdiction over the water itself." This was the key. It wasn't about the rules. It was about the territory. Karen's entire argument rested on a single, fundamental premise: that my property line ended at the water's edge and the pond belonged to the HOA. This was the foundation of her case, and if it was flawed, her entire structure of authority would collapse. I knew with the certainty of a son who had explored every inch of this land with his grandfather that she was wrong. I remembered Grandpa standing with me on this very shore, explaining how the pond was the heart of the property, how the deed included full riparian rights. But memory wasn't proof. I needed documents. I needed the chain of title. I needed the original survey my grandfather had performed himself before the sale. "I'm going up to the attic," I announced, folding the letter and placing it aside. "Grandpa kept everything. If there's proof, it's up there." The attic was a time capsule, hot and still, smelling of old paper, cedar, and dust. It was where my childhood memories were stored in cardboard boxes and where my grandfather's life was carefully archived. In the far corner, under a canvas tarp, was the oak chest I was looking for. It was heavy, bound with iron straps, and locked with a small brass key that I knew was in the top drawer of Grandpa's old roll-top desk downstairs. Minutes later, I lifted the heavy lid. The top layer was personal: his army uniform, neatly folded, a box of medals including a bronze star, and stacks of letters from my grandmother. Beneath that, I found what I was searching for. It wasn't just one document, but a treasure trove. There were rolled-up canvas maps, their edges brittle with age. There were leather-bound ledgers filled with my grandfather's precise, elegant handwriting, detailing survey data. And at the very bottom, in a long, protective cardboard tube, was the master document. I carefully slid it out and unrolled it on the dusty floorboards. It was the original 1955 survey plat of the entire 200-acre parcel, hand-drawn by my grandfather. The lines were rendered in black ink, the elevations and features noted in his familiar script. My finger traced the boundary of the 5 acres he had carved out for himself, the parcel he had left to me. The line didn't stop at the pond's edge. It went straight through it, encompassing the entire body of water, and then continued for another 50 feet on the other side. The pond wasn't a boundary. It was the centerpiece of my inheritance. But there was more. I found the deed of sale from 1998, when he sold the 195 acres to the developer, Northgate Homes. Attached to it was a legal description of the sold parcel, and it explicitly referenced my grandfather's 1955 survey. It described the boundary of the developer's land as beginning 50 feet from the mean high water mark of the westernmost shore of the Miller Pond. They hadn't bought the pond. They hadn't even bought the land right up to it. My grandfather, in his quiet wisdom, had retained a 50-foot buffer around the entire body of water. Karen wasn't just wrong, she was spectacularly, foundationally wrong. The Lakeside Meadows community didn't actually have any legal claim to the lake it was named after. For 20 years, the HOA had been operating under a colossal lie, or at best, a colossal error. They had built their walking paths, their picnic areas, and their community gazebo on land they didn't own. They had been charging residents for access to an amenity that belonged lock, stock, and barrel to me. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. This was no longer about a dock. This was about fraud on a massive scale. Karen, in her blind arrogance, hadn't just picked a fight. She had handed me the keys to her kingdom and demanded I unlock the door to her own destruction. She wanted my property records. Oh, she was going to get them. The weight of the documents felt tangible, a physical anchor of truth in a sea of bureaucratic nonsense. I spent the rest of the day in my grandfather's old study, the roll-top desk covered with the sprawling, brittle maps and deeds. The 1955 survey was the Rosetta Stone. Every line, every call-out was a testament to my grandfather's meticulous nature. He had used a system of metes and bounds, describing the property lines with bearings and distances tied to permanent markers, iron pins he had driven into the ground himself, stone mounds and ancient oak trees. It was a language I understood intimately from my own engineering career. It was precise, verifiable, and legally binding. I cross-referenced the survey with the 1998 deed of sale. The language was unambiguous. The parcel sold to Northgate Homes was explicitly defined as excluding the pond and the 50-foot buffer zone around it. The developer had purchased the surrounding land, but the jewel in the center remained with the Miller family. The HOA's claim was not just weak, it was non-existent. Their entire identity, their very name, was based on a piece of property they had never legally possessed. A deep, cold anger began to replace my initial shock. This wasn't a simple mistake. A developer, a title company, and an army of lawyers had been involved in the creation of Lakeside Meadows. For them to have all missed a detail this enormous seemed improbable. It felt more like a calculated deception, a land grab hidden in plain sight. The developer likely knew they couldn't acquire the pond, so they built a community around it and created an HOA that simply pretended it was theirs, assuming no one would ever check the original records. For 2 decades, they had gotten away with it. They had monetized my family's legacy, selling homes based on the promise of lakeside living, and charging residents fees to maintain property that wasn't theirs. And now Karen, the latest in a line of tin pot dictators, was trying to use that fraudulent claim to bully me. The irony was so thick I could taste it. She was threatening me with fines for building on my own land, while her entire organization was, in effect, trespassing on a grand scale. I carefully photographed every page of every document with my phone, creating a digital archive. Then I rolled the precious originals back up and placed them in the heavy tube. This was my ammunition, and I needed to protect it. My next step was to move from historical certainty to modern, legally irrefutable proof. My grandfather's survey was the foundation, but I needed a contemporary, licensed surveyor to validate his findings and translate them into a format that no court or lawyer could dismiss. I found a firm run by a man named Al Jorgensen, a grizzled professional with a reputation for being surgically precise and utterly intolerant of shortcuts. When I called him and explained the situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "The HOA is claiming your pond, but you have the original plat showing you own it plus a 50-foot buffer?" "That's correct," I said, "and the deed of sale to the developer references that plat. And they've built community structures inside that buffer? A walking path, benches, a gazebo, and picnic tables," I confirmed. There was a low whistle. "Son, if what you're saying is true, you're sitting on a bombshell. I'm busy, but for a job like this, I'll make time. I want to see this for myself." Al agreed to come out the following Monday. In the meantime, the Friday deadline loomed. I had no intention of removing the dock, but I also didn't want to give Karen the satisfaction of a simple, defiant no. I decided to play her game, But by my rules, I drafted a letter. It was polite, formal, and deliberately vague. I wrote, "Dear Ms. Billings, I am in receipt of your letter dated date. I take the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Lakeside Meadows community very seriously. To ensure full compliance with all applicable property laws and recorded covenants, I have begun a comprehensive review of the original deeds and survey plats associated with my property and the adjacent parcels. This process requires careful research and consultation with land use professionals to verify the precise historical boundaries. I trust you will agree that accuracy is paramount in these matters. I will be in touch once my due diligence is complete. Sincerely, Jack Miller." I sent it via certified mail, just as she had done. It was a delaying tactic, but it was also a warning shot. I was telling her, in the most bureaucratic language I could muster, that I was not going to be steamrolled. I was checking the facts. The subtext was clear. You had better be damn sure of yours. The letter would infuriate her. Her power was based on immediate, unquestioning obedience. A request for time to review the facts would feel like an act of rebellion. It would also, I hoped, make her overconfident. She would see it as the desperate stalling of a man who knew he was beaten. Let her think that. Let her underestimate me. While I waited for Al the surveyor, I started doing some quiet reconnaissance of my own. I took a walk along the community path that circled the pond. It was a well-maintained gravel track, about a quarter of a mile long. Every 50 feet or so, there was a handsome wooden bench with a small brass plaque that read, "Donated by the Lakeside Meadows HOA." The large gazebo on the far shore, a popular spot for neighborhood gatherings, had an even bigger sign proclaiming it as a community project. The HOA hadn't just used my land, they had branded it. They had planted their flag on it, both literally and figuratively. I saw one of my neighbors, an elderly man named Arthur Henderson, meticulously tending to a small flower bed beside his house. He was known for his prize-winning roses. I'd heard whispers that Karen was giving him trouble too. I decided to stop. "Beautiful roses, Mr. Henderson," I said. He looked up, his face creased with worry, and wiped his brow. "Thank you, Jack. Trying to keep them nice. Though apparently my garden gnomes are in violation of aesthetic standards." He sighed. "Got a letter yesterday, $50 fine." I shook my head. "Garden gnomes?" "Two of them," he said, pointing with his trowel to a pair of cheerful, pointy-hatted figures tucked among the rose bushes. "Karen says they're tacky yard art. I've had them for 20 years. The pettiness of it was breathtaking. This was what Karen did. She manufactured infractions to sustain her sense of power. "I got a letter too," I said, my voice low. "About my dock." Arthur's eyes widened with sympathy. "Heard about that. She was talking about it at the last board meeting. Said she was going to make an example of you." So it was a public campaign. She was using me to consolidate her power, to show everyone what happens when you defy the queen. "Well," I said, a grim smile touching my lips, "she might find I'm a different kind of example than she was hoping for." Arthur looked at me, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "If you're fighting her, son," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you let me know. You're not the only one around here who's tired of being pushed around." I had found my first ally. The fight was no longer just mine. Al Jorgensen arrived exactly at 8 a.m. on Monday, his truck a mobile command center of surveying technology. It was packed with GPS rovers, a robotic total station, and cases of tripods and prisms. Al himself was what you'd get if you crossed a college professor with a lumberjack, a big man with a thoughtful, intelligent face and hands that had clearly seen a lifetime of hard work. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a perceptive gaze that seemed to take in the entire property in a single sweep. "Let's see the old maps," he said, foregoing any small talk. We spread the 1955 plat across the hood of his truck. He spent a long time studying it, his finger tracing the same lines I had, occasionally letting out a low grunt of appreciation. "Your grandfather was good," he murmured. "Damn good. Look at this closure. Textbook. He wasn't just a farmer with a transit, he was an artist." He then examined the 1998 deed of sale, reading the legal description of the excluded parcel multiple times. "Explicit," he said, tapping the paper. "Clear as a bell. It references this plat and sets the boundary 50 feet from the high water mark. There's no ambiguity here. The question is, what does the HOA's paperwork say? That's the million-dollar question, I replied. And I suspect the answer is whatever they wanted it to say. Al nodded grimly. Well, let's find your grandfather's pins. Paper is one thing. Iron in the ground is another. For the next 6 hours, Al and I became detectives of the landscape. Armed with a sophisticated metal detector and the old map, we hunted for the original survey markers. We found the first one, an iron pin buried under a thick knot of roots at the northeast corner of my 5-acre plot. The detector shrieked, and after 10 minutes of careful digging, we uncovered the rusted but unmistakable piece of rebar my grandfather had driven into the earth more than 60 years ago. Al set up his GPS rover over the point, taking a reading that locked its position in space with centimeter-level accuracy. We found another pin at the northwest corner, hidden beneath a decorative rock that a previous HOA board had probably thought was a nice landscaping touch. And then we started tracing the critical boundary, the one 50 feet from the pond. Using the old map and his modern equipment, Al was able to project the line across the terrain. The results were devastatingly clear. The HOA's gravel walking path was, in its entirety, on my side of the line. 3 of their community benches and the entire foundation of their prized gazebo were squarely on my property. They weren't just encroaching, they were occupying. They either used a completely fraudulent survey or they did no survey at all, Al concluded, shaking his head as he looked at the data on his controller. They just laid out the development based on a sketch and hoped for the best. This is professional malpractice of the highest order. The title insurance company that signed off on this is in for a world of hurt. He spent the rest of the day gathering data, shooting hundreds of points to create a new, unimpeachable survey map that overlaid his findings on top of the HOA's recorded plat. The discrepancy was a glaring, undeniable gash across the map. While Al worked, I received my second letter from Karen. This one was dripping with condescension. Dear Mr. Miller, it began, while I appreciate your sudden interest in due diligence, the matter of your unauthorized dock is not open for debate or research. The deadline has passed. As of today, a daily penalty of $100 is being assessed against your property. If the structure is not removed within 7 days, we will have it removed and the costs, along with all accumulated fines, will be placed as a lien against your title. Your attempts to stall are noted and are entirely without merit. The community's property rights are clear and non-negotiable. Her arrogance was a gift. She was so blinded by her power that she couldn't conceive of being wrong. She was escalating, creating a paper trail of her own recklessness, and I was diligently saving every piece of it. That evening, I called Arthur Henderson. Arthur, I said, I have a question for you. Do you have a copy of the HOA's founding documents? The original covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and the plat map they filed with the county? I think so, he said. They gave us a binder thick as a phone book when we bought the house. It's in a closet somewhere, gathering dust. Could I possibly borrow it? I asked. An hour later, Arthur was at my door with the binder. It was just as he described, a 3-inch thick behemoth filled with legalese. I thanked him profusely and promised to return it soon. He lingered at the door. Jack, he said quietly, I spoke to Martha Jenkins today. 2 houses down. Karen is fining her because her wind chimes are creating noise pollution. And the Garcias, the young couple on the corner, they got a notice because their son's basketball hoop is visible from the street. The pattern was clear. It wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about control, exercised through petty, relentless harassment. Karen was a predator, and she fed on the fear and compliance of her neighbors. Thank you for telling me, Arthur, I said. This is important. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk with a pot of coffee, Al's preliminary findings, my grandfather's maps, and the HOA's Bible spread out before me. I was looking for the weapon they would use against me so I could turn it back on them. I found it in Article 10, Enforcement. It laid out the HOA's power to levy fines, place liens, and even initiate foreclosure for unpaid debts. But it also detailed the process. It required written notices, opportunities to be heard, and crucially, a majority vote of the board for any action beyond a standard fine. To foreclose, they needed a vote of the entire community at a special meeting. And then I saw the key. Section 10.5, Dispute Resolution, stated that any dispute over property lines or interpretation of the covenants must first be brought before the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, of which Karen was the chair. The ARC's decision could then be appealed to the full board. In her letter, Karen had skipped her own process. In her haste to bring the hammer down on me, she had declared judgment as president without a committee hearing. It was a minor procedural error, but in a legal fight, procedure is everything. I also found the plat map filed by the HOA. It was a clean, computer-generated drawing. On it, the pond was colored blue and labeled Community Lake. The property lines for the lots bordering the water stopped neatly at the shore. There was no mention of a 50-foot buffer, no reference to the 1955 Miller survey. It was, as Al had suspected, a complete fabrication. It was a fantasy map created for marketing purposes and then laundered into a legal document. She had sent me a demand. Now I would send one back. The next morning, I made a phone call. After some research, I found a lawyer named Isabella Rossi. Her website described her as a real estate and property law specialist with extensive experience in homeowner association disputes. Her photo showed a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She was exactly what I needed. When I got her on the phone and gave her the 30-second summary of the situation, veteran, inherited property, fraudulent HOA map, multi-million-dollar trespassing liability, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a single enthusiastic word, yes. We met that afternoon. I laid out all the documents on her massive conference table, my grandfather's survey, the 1998 deed of sale, Al Jorgensen's brand new, legally certified plat map showing the encroachment, and the stack of threatening letters from Karen. Izzy, as she insisted I call her, circled the table like a shark. She picked up each document, her eyes scanning them with incredible speed. She spent a full 10 minutes just looking at the comparison between my grandfather's map and the HOA's fraudulent one. "This is the most egregious case of developer fraud I have ever seen," she said, her voice a low hum of professional excitement. "They didn't just fudge a boundary line. They invented a geography and sold it to hundreds of people. The liability here is staggering. The developer, the title company, the original surveyors, they're all on the hook. But my immediate problem is Karen," I said. "She's threatening to put a lien on my house and tear down my dock." "Let her," Izzy said with a predatory grin. "Let her try. It's called damages. Every legally baseless action she takes against you, every dollar in fines she assesses, every threatening letter she sends, just adds to the bill we're going to hand her and the HOA. She is our star witness for the prosecution." Izzy's strategy was not to defend, but to attack. We weren't going to argue about the dock. We were going to challenge the very existence of the lakeside meadows as it was currently defined. First, she drafted a formal response to Karen's latest threat. It was a legal masterpiece, both polite and utterly menacing. It pointed out Karen's failure to follow the HOA's own dispute resolution process by not convening the Architectural Review Committee. It formally disputed the HOA's claim to the pond and the surrounding land, citing the 1955 survey and the 1998 deed of sale. It stated that the HOA's plat map appeared to be fraudulent and that any attempt to place a lien on my property based on this fraudulent claim would be met with a lawsuit for slander of title, a serious charge that could carry massive penalties. The letter concluded by reserving all rights to seek damages for decades of trespassing and unauthorized use of private property. "This," Izzy said, holding up the letter, "is a declaration of war, but it's couched in such reasonable legal language that if she ignores it, she will look like a reckless tyrant to any judge who sees it." We sent the letter to Karen and, more importantly, to every other member of the HOA board. Karen might be a dictator, but she still needed her board's compliance. We wanted to put them on notice that they were about to become complicit in a massive legal battle they couldn't possibly win. While we waited for the fallout, Izzy filed for a temporary injunction and a quiet title action in county court. The quiet title action was the main weapon. It's a lawsuit designed to settle disputes over property ownership once and for all. It would force the HOA and any other involved parties to prove their claim to my land in front of a judge. The injunction was to prevent them from taking any remedial action, like tearing down my dock or filing a lien. While the case was being decided, the court system moved slowly, but just filing the action sent a clear message. The battle was now on my terms, in a venue where Karen's bluster and authority meant nothing. Facts and laws were all that mattered. As I'd hoped, our letter caused chaos among the HOA board. Arthur Henderson called me the evening after it was delivered. "Jack, you've kicked the hornet's nest," he said, a note of glee in his voice. There's a flurry of emails going back and forth between the board members. The treasurer, a fellow named George, is panicking. He's asking Karen what legal counsel she consulted before threatening you. The board secretary, another of her cronies, is trying to calm everyone down, but the cat's out of the bag. You've made them realize they have personal liability. This was a key part of the strategy. HOA board members are typically volunteers, and while they are protected to some degree by insurance, that protection often doesn't cover actions taken in bad faith or with gross negligence. Izzy's letter made it clear that continuing to follow Karen down this path was not just a poor decision, but a personally risky one. Karen's response came 2 days later. It was not a letter, but an email sent to the entire community. It was a masterclass in propaganda and deflection. She portrayed herself as the victim, the noble guardian of the community under attack by a wealthy landowner trying to steal the community's lake. She wrote, "Mr. Miller, a non-member who enjoys the benefits of our beautiful neighborhood without contributing to its upkeep, is now attempting a hostile legal maneuver to seize control of our most precious asset, our lake. He is using high-priced lawyers to try and rewrite history and take away the walking paths, the gazebo, and the waterfront access that all of us paid for and enjoy. This is an attack on every single one of us." She announced a special community meeting to be held in 1 week's time. The agenda, to discuss the ongoing legal threat posed by Mr. Miller and to vote on measures to protect the community's assets. She was trying to frame it as a David versus Goliath story, with the small, plucky community as David and me as the greedy giant. She was going to put my rights up for a popular vote. "It's perfect," Izzy said when I forwarded her the email. "She's doing our work for us. She's convening the very forum we need to expose her in front of everyone she's been lying to. Get ready, Jack. We're going to that meeting, and we're not just bringing documents, we're bringing the truth." I spent the next week working with Izzy and Al to prepare. Al created a series of large poster-sized maps. The first showed the fraudulent HOA plat. The second showed my grandfather's 1955 survey. The third was the killer, a satellite image of the Lakeside Meadows community with Al's verified boundary line overlaid in a thick, bright red. The red line sliced directly through the walking path and the gazebo, showing the encroachment with undeniable clarity. We also prepared a simple, one-page handout for every resident, summarizing the facts and citing the public record document numbers from the county clerk's office, so they could verify everything themselves. Arthur Henderson, now a fully fledged co-conspirator, worked his own magic. He quietly spoke to the neighbors Karen had wronged, the Garcias with the basketball hoop, Martha Jenkins with the wind chimes, and a dozen others who had been nursing grievances for years. He told them, "If you want to see Karen get what's coming to her, you need to be at that meeting on Tuesday night. Something big is going to happen." The stage was set. Karen thought she was arranging a public execution. In reality, she had just built the gallows for herself. The week leading up to the special meeting was a strange combination of tense silence and furious preparation. Outwardly, the neighborhood was calm, but underneath, a current of nervous energy was building. Karen's email had done its job. It had polarized the community. I saw neighbors who used to wave at me now avert their eyes, their faces tight with suspicion. They believed her narrative. They saw me as the enemy, the rich outsider coming to take away their playground. A few even glared at the little dock on my pond as if it were an invading warship. But others, the ones Arthur had spoken to, would give me a subtle nod or a thumbs up when they thought no one was looking. They were the silent minority, the ones who had felt Karen's boot on their necks and were praying for a change. They were my sleeper agents. In my house, which we now jokingly called the War Room, Izzy, Al, and I finalized our presentation. It was designed to be a methodical, irrefutable deployment of facts. We weren't going for fiery rhetoric, we were going for the cold, hard shock of the truth. Al's giant maps were the centerpiece. Izzy prepared a binder for every member of the HOA board, containing copies of every relevant deed, survey, and legal filing. My job was to be the narrator, the person who could connect the legal documents to a human story, the story of my grandfather and my family's legacy. Remember, Jack, Izzy coached me, your greatest strength is your credibility. You're a 20-year veteran. You're calm under pressure. Let Karen be the hysterical, emotional one. You just deliver the facts one after another, like you're giving a briefing. Let the evidence speak for itself. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the end of my new dock and sat down, the cool wood beneath me. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the still, dark water of the pond. This water, this land. It was more than just property. It was a lifetime of memories. It was my grandfather teaching me how to skip stones. It was the first fish my son ever caught. It was the place I came to find peace after years in war zones. Karen wasn't just trying to take a piece of land. She was trying to desecrate a sanctuary, and I would not let that happen. The next evening, the community clubhouse was packed. It was a large, soulless room with a vaulted ceiling and fluorescent lighting that cast a sickly pale glow on everything. The air was thick with tension and cheap coffee. I saw Arthur give me a discreet nod from the back of the room, where he had assembled a small contingent of the resistance. Izzy and I took seats in the front row. She placed a heavy briefcase on the floor between us. The HOA board, 5 of them in total, sat at a long table on a low stage at the front. Karen was in the center, a self-satisfied smirk on her face. She was wearing a bright red blazer, a power color, and she radiated an aura of absolute control. She banged a gavel on the table, a sound that was unnecessarily loud in the crowded room. This special meeting of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association is now in session, she announced, her voice booming. She launched into her prepared speech, a 20-minute diatribe about community values, the sanctity of the rules, and the external threat facing their way of life. She never used my name, referring to me only as the adjacent landowner or the hostile party. She painted a picture of a greedy developer trying to exploit a legal loophole to steal their lake. He wants to take your morning walks away from you, she thundered, pointing a finger dramatically toward the back of the room. He wants to tear down the gazebo where your children have their birthday parties. He wants to put a fence around our lake and keep you out. We cannot and we will not let this happen. A murmur of angry agreement rippled through her supporters in the crowd. She was good, I had to admit. She was a masterful propagandist. Finally, she turned her attention to me, her eyes narrowing. The hostile party's lawyer has sent us a letter full of confusing maps and so-called historical claims. They demand we cede our community's most valuable asset. Tonight, we will vote. We will vote to authorize this board to use all necessary legal means, including a special assessment on every homeowner, to fight this outrageous land grab and protect what is ours. She was asking them for a blank check for a war. Izzy leaned over to me and whispered, "It's time." Before Karen could call for the vote, Izzy stood up. She was not tall, but she commanded attention. "Madam President," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily through the room, "before you call a vote that will have massive financial and legal consequences for every person in this room, my client, Sergeant Jack Miller, a 20-year veteran of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, has a right to be heard." Karen was momentarily thrown off balance. She had expected to control the entire meeting. "This is a community meeting, not a courtroom," she snapped. "Mr. Miller is not a member." "He is the subject of this meeting," Izzy countered smoothly. "And under basic principles of fairness, not to mention your own bylaws which provide for a right to be heard in disputes, he has the floor. Or are you afraid of what he has to say?" The challenge hung in the air. The crowd murmured. Backing down would make Karen look weak and fearful. "Fine," she spat, her face flushing. "5 minutes, Mr. Miller. Then we vote." "Thank you," I said, standing up and walking to the front. I didn't go to the podium. I stood in the center of the floor, in the middle of the residence. I had Al's giant maps with me, rolled up in a tube. "My name is Jack Miller," I began, my voice steady. My family has owned the land this community is named for since 1947. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to show you what was taken from my family and what you were sold under false pretenses. I unrolled the first map, the HOA's own fraudulent plat. I tacked it to a corkboard on an easel. This is the map the developer gave you. It shows a community lake. It's a very nice map. It is also a work of fiction. Then I unrolled my grandfather's 1955 survey and tacked it up right next to it. This is the legal survey of the land recorded with the county from which your community was carved out. It is the primary legal document. The difference was subtle but clear to anyone who looked. Finally, I unrolled the third map, the satellite image with Al's bright red line of truth. I placed it over the HOA's map. A collective gasp went through the room. The red line showed the gazebo, the path, and several picnic areas sitting squarely on the Miller property side. This red line, I said, my voice cutting through the silence, is not my opinion. This is the legally surveyed boundary of my property, confirmed last week by a licensed state surveyor, based on iron pins that have been in the ground for over 60 years. As you can see, the community lake you've been paying dues to maintain is, and has always been, the Miller family pond. The land the walking path and gazebo are on is, and has always been, my private property. I let that sink in for a moment. The room was dead silent. I could see people turning to their neighbors, whispering, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They were beginning to realize they had been lied to, not by me, but by the very people they had trusted. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum created by the sudden, shocking collision of their reality with the truth. Every eye was fixed on the maps, on the damning red line that cut through their shared identity. Karen's face had gone from a confident, florid red to a blotchy, pale white. She looked at the maps, then at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. She had built her entire platform on the idea of protecting the community's assets, and I had just proven, in front of everyone, that the primary asset was never theirs to begin with. This is a trick, she finally stammered, her voice losing its booming authority and becoming thin and reedy. He's using fake maps. Our lawyers approved our documents. Then your lawyers were either incompetent or complicit, Izzy said, stepping forward and placing a thick bound binder on the table in front of each board member. In these binders, you will find certified copies of every document Mr. Miller has presented, all sourced from the county recorder's office. You will find the original 1955 survey, plat, the 1998 deed of sale explicitly excluding the pond and buffer zone, and the new survey from a licensed professional confirming the boundaries. These are not fake maps. These are public records. They are facts. George, the treasurer, a nervous-looking man with a perpetually worried expression, opened his binder. His face grew visibly paler as he flipped through the pages. He looked at the HOA's fraudulent plat map, then at the certified deed of sale. He looked up at Karen, his eyes wide with panic. "Karen," he whispered, his voice trembling, "the deed. It says right here, excluding the Miller Pond and a 50-foot buffer. It's exactly as he says." Karen shot him a look of pure venom, a silent command to shut up, but the damage was done. The truth was out, confirmed by one of her own. A wave of angry murmurs erupted across the room. People were standing up, talking to each other, pointing at the maps. The narrative she had so carefully crafted was shattering in real time. A man in the third row stood up. "So what have we been paying for?" he shouted. "For 20 years, my dues have gone to lake maintenance. Are you telling me we've been paying to maintain this man's private property? And the special assessment for the gazebo?" Another woman called out. "We paid $10,000 for that. Did we build a $10,000 gazebo on someone else's land?" The questions came like a flood, a torrent of outrage from people who finally understood the scale of the deception. They weren't angry at me anymore. They were furious with the developer who had lied to them, and with the HOA board, their board, who had either perpetuated the lie or been too incompetent to uncover it. I held up a hand for silence. To my surprise, the room quieted. "I understand your anger," I said, my voice calm and steady in the midst of the chaos. You were sold a bill of goods. The developer and the original HOA board built this community on a foundation of fraud. But the immediate issue is what's happening now. Your president, Ms. Billings, has not been acting to protect your interests. She has been acting to protect her own power. I turned to face Karen directly. Ms. Billings has threatened me, levied thousands of dollars in illegal fines, and attempted to place a lien on my property, all without legal standing. She did this without consulting her own board, without following her own bylaws, and without doing the slightest bit of due diligence. She has exposed this community to a lawsuit of massive proportions, not just from me, but potentially from every one of you, for misuse of your funds. Izzy stepped forward again. To that end, she announced, her voice crisp and clear, we have today filed a lawsuit against the Lakeside Meadows HOA for 2 decades of trespassing, property damage, and unjust enrichment. We have also filed a motion for an injunction to halt all HOA operations on the Miller property immediately. Furthermore, we will be petitioning the court to appoint a receiver to take over the HOA's finances, pending a full audit to determine how your money has been spent. The word audit sent another shockwave through the room. Karen's face, if possible, grew even whiter. And one more thing, Izzy said, pulling a single piece of paper from her briefcase. She walked up to the stage and handed it not to Karen, but to George, the treasurer. This is a preliminary invoice. It is a bill for 20 years of unauthorized commercial use of the Miller Pond and the surrounding 50-foot buffer zone. It includes rental fees, calculated at fair market value, for the land occupied by your path and gazebo, and a percentage of all HOA dues collected under the premise of lake access. The total, as of today, is $2.7 million. The number hung in the air, a stunning, incomprehensible figure. George, the treasurer, looked at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. He dropped it on the table. The room was in an uproar. People were shouting at the board, demanding answers. Karen stood frozen, her reign collapsing around her in a matter of minutes. Arthur Henderson's voice rose above the din. I call for a vote, he yelled from the back. A vote of no confidence in President Karen Billings and the entire board. A chorus of "aye" and "seconded" erupted from all corners. It was a full-blown insurrection. Karen finally snapped. The mask of the calm, authoritative president fell away, revealing the snarling, cornered animal beneath. You can't do this, she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. I am the president. I have the authority. This community will fall apart without me. This is my community. It was never your community, Karen, I said quietly, but my voice seemed to cut through her hysterics. A community is built on trust and respect, not on lies and bullying. You've done enough damage. The other board members, seeing the tide turn so completely, began to distance themselves from her, their faces masks of self-preservation. George, the treasurer, stood up. I resign from the board, effective immediately, he stammered and practically fled from the stage. The secretary followed suit. It was a complete rout. Karen was left alone at the table, a queen without a court, surrounded by the angry faces of the subjects she had betrayed. Her empire had crumbled, not with a bang, but with the quiet unrolling of an old map. The chaos of the meeting was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the Lakeside Meadows HOA effectively ceased to exist in its previous form. With the president disgraced, the treasurer and secretary resigned, and the remaining 2 board members in a state of shell-shocked paralysis, the organization was rudderless. The court, acting on Izzy's petition, moved swiftly. A judge granted our temporary injunction, formally barring the HOA from setting foot on my property, which now officially included the lake, the path, and the gazebo. The judge also approved the appointment of a neutral, third-party receiver to take control of the HOA's finances and records. This was a critical victory. It took the checkbook out of Karen's hands and put it into the hands of a court-appointed professional whose only job was to uncover the truth. The receiver, a stern-faced accountant named Ms. Albright, descended on the HOA's small office like a force of nature. She seized every laptop, every filing cabinet, and every bank statement. Karen, I was told, tried to deny her access, claiming executive privilege. Ms. Albright simply showed her the court order, and told her that if she didn't step aside, she would be held in contempt of court. Defeated, Karen could only watch as 20 years of her carefully controlled records were hauled away. The audit began, and the whispers started almost immediately. It turned out that legal fees were a common line item in the HOA budget. But when the receiver started matching invoices to payments, she found that many of the payments weren't going to a law firm. They were going to a consulting company that was wholly owned by Karen's brother-in-law. She had been using the HOA's money to fight her petty wars against residents, funneling the funds to her own family under the guise of legal expenses. The garden gnome fines, the wind chime violations, all of it was a pretext to generate legal actions that she could then pay her family to manage. My case was just the biggest and most blatant example. She had spent over $15,000 of community money on legal consulting for her campaign against my doc before Izzy ever got involved. It was a self-sustaining cycle of corruption. While the receiver dug into the finances, I had a decision to make. Legally, the $2.7 million invoice was solid. Izzy was confident we could win a judgment for that amount, which would bankrupt the HOA and likely force every homeowner into a massive special assessment to pay the debt. But that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to punish my neighbors for the sins of the developer and the corruption of Karen Billings. I wanted justice, not revenge. I wanted to restore the community, not destroy it. I called a meeting, not an HOA meeting, but an informal gathering of neighbors at my house. I invited Arthur, the Garcias, Martha Jenkins, and a dozen other residents who had been on the receiving end of Karen's tyranny. We sat in my living room, the same room where my grandfather used to read his surveying books. I told them my plan. I have no intention of collecting that $2.7 million judgment, I said. The relief in the room was palpable. My goal was never to bankrupt this community. It was to end the corruption and establish the truth. The lake and the land around it are mine. That is now a settled legal fact. But I grew up here. I want this to be a community, a real one. I laid out my proposal. I would agree to lease the lake, the walking path, and the land the gazebo sits on to a newly formed, democratically elected HOA. The term of the lease would be 99 years. The cost of the lease would be $1 per year. There were, however, conditions. The new HOA's bylaws would have to be completely rewritten. They would include strict term limits for all board members, absolute transparency in all financial matters, and a resident's bill of rights that protected them from the kind of petty harassment that Karen had specialized in. All enforcement actions would require a review by an independent committee, and no liens could be filed without a vote of the entire community. I'm not giving you back the land, I explained. I am giving you permission to use it. My family will remain the owners. This ensures that no future board can ever again claim it as their own or use it as a weapon. The $1 a year lease is a legal formality that ensures you have the right to be here, but it also ensures that my family has the final say. If any future board becomes tyrannical, the lease can be terminated. Arthur Henderson, his eyes shining, spoke for the group. "Jack," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that is more than fair. It's generous. You hold all the cards and you're choosing to build a bridge instead of a wall." We spent the next few weeks working with Izzy and a small committee of residents to draft the new bylaws. We created a document that was about protecting property values, not through intimidation, but through mutual respect. It was about creating a community, not a kingdom. The final confrontation with Karen was less dramatic than you might think. It didn't happen in a courtroom or a public meeting. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was out on my dock checking the boards when I saw her. She was standing on what used to be the community side of the pond, now just the other side of my property. Her car was parked on the street behind her, filled with boxes. A for sale sign was staked into her lawn. She just stood there, staring across the water at me, her face a ruin of anger and defeat. She had lost everything. The receiver's audit had led to a referral to the district attorney's office for fraud and embezzlement. The board she controlled was gone. The power she craved had vanished. The community she had ruled with an iron fist had turned on her completely. She was financially and socially ruined, forced to sell her house to cover her mounting legal bills. She looked at me, and for a moment I thought she might yell or scream. Instead, she just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, turned, and got into her car. I watched her drive away, leaving Lakeside Meadows for good. I felt no triumph, no joy in her defeat, just a quiet, somber sense of justice. She was a deeply unhappy person who had tried to fill the emptiness inside her with power over others. In the end, it had consumed her. I had won, but more importantly, the community had won. They had won their freedom. They had won a future where they could live without fear of a $50 fine for a garden gnome. The old fraudulent HOA was dissolved. A new one, founded on the principles we had laid out, was voted into existence. Arthur Henderson was unanimously elected its first president. His first official act was to present me with a framed check for $1 for the first year's lease. My son and I finished the dock. We added a small bench at the end. Sometimes in the evenings, Sarah and I will sit there and watch the sunset reflect off the water, the same water my grandfather cherished. Neighbors now wave as they walk along the path, and they stop to chat. The Garcia's son plays basketball in his driveway, and Martha Jenkins's wind chimes tinkle musically in the breeze. The lake is once again a place of peace, not a source of conflict. My grandfather's legacy is secure, and the community, a real community, is finally starting to heal. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as an old map in an attic, waiting for someone to finally read it.